Good afternoon again, everyone. It's a pleasure to see you all here in the Oak Room and all these folks who join us on Zoom. I'm pleased to present our fourth in the series of Women Adventurers. Today's title is Jane Goodall, Adventure to Activism. After 60 years of studying the social and family interactions of wild chimpanzees in Tanzania, Goodall founded the Roots and Shoots program, working extensively on conservation and animal welfare issues. I'm pleased to say that today's speaker, Jane Brockmann, is one of our own, having lived at Oak Hammock for nearly a year. Dr. Brockmann is an emeritus professor of biology at the University of Florida. Her field of study is animal behaviors and ethology. Her research focuses on the reproductive behavior and biology of horseshoe crabs. She received her undergraduate education at Tufts University, her PhD from the University of Wisconsin in Madison, and a National Science Foundation postdoctoral fellowship at Oxford University in the United Kingdom with Dr. Richard Dawkins. She held a position in the Department of Biology at the University of Florida from 1976 until her retirement in 2011, where she taught animal behavior and supervised MS and PhD students. Dr. Brockmann's research has been supported by grants from the National Science Foundation and most recently for a study on the evolution of alternative tactics in horseshoe crabs. She's the author of 85 journal articles and book chapters and co-editor of 2 books, The American Horseshoe Crab in 2003 and Alternative Reproductive Tactics. That's Cambridge University in 2008. Currently, she is consulting with policymakers as they develop conservation strategies for horseshoe crabs along the Atlantic and Gulf coasts. And now to speak about Jane Goodall is Jane Brockmann. Thank you.
Ready? Okay, great. Well, when I got this assignment from Deb, I really didn't know very much about Jane Goodall. I knew who she was, that she'd studied chimpanzees, but I didn't know a lot about her. And I began, one of the first things that I learned when I started reading up about her was that she was one of the most recognized living scientists in the world. And this seemed quite surprising to me. I mean, an animal behavior is the most, I don't know about that, the most popular scientist in the world. I don't know about that. But then I got a hold of her CV and I looked at an incredible array of awards and recognitions, accolades that she's had. She was, for example, knighted by the Queen. She's received the Kyoto Prize, which was a very important scientific prize early on. Has recently received the Cosmos Prize, the Templeton Prize, and the Stephen Hawking Prize. So a great array of awards. So that kind of sort of lends support to the idea that she's a recognized living scientist, popularly recognized. But then I discovered this, which really convinced me completely that she is the most popular. Jane Goodall has her own Barbie doll and her own Lego set. The Barbie doll comes complete with her trademark khaki shirt and shorts, a notebook, a pair of binoculars, and David Graybeard, her favorite little chimpanzee. And so there are other people like Billie Jean King, and there's an astronaut, but she's not really in this list of Barbie inspiring women series. But there aren't any other scientists in this list. So Jane is really apparently the most recognized living scientist. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about her. The explanations that are given for why she's so popular are things like this, this is in a National Geographic biography of her, that she is famous, she became famous because of her ability to observe and connect with chimpanzees. This is patently ridiculous. I mean, there are thousands of people who have an ability to observe, and many of them connect very well with their animals, some even with chimpanzees, even other people studying, and they're nothing like as popular as she is. So I'll let you, as I go through this sort of description of her life, I'll let you think a little bit about what you think made the difference. Why has she become so popular when others not so much? They're nothing like Jane Goodall. So she was born in 1934. She was the daughter of her father was Mortimer Morris Goodall. He was an elite race car driver for Aston Martin, drove Aston Martins. He also had a day job testing telephones, but this was his love, was race car driving. And her mother, Van, who plays an important role, as you will see, she was a secretary, and later she'd always wanted, and eventually she succeeded in writing adventure books. Jane has a sister a couple years later, younger. She was born in London, but they moved out to Weybridge, where they were a little closer to the race car track. When Jane talks about her childhood, she talks about it as being just this idyllic childhood where she had all these pets. She always had pets. And she loved to watch animals, whatever was around, chickens and dogs and whatever happened to be available. And she loved to read, and she read about Africa and animals. Dr. Dolittle books, Jungle books, but she particularly loved the Tarzan and Jane series. She talked about that quite recently in a interview. When she was 10 or so, she decided that she was going to be Dr. Dolittle. She was going to go out to Africa and study animals. And she really held on to that little dream through much of her life, through her early life. And then the war came. So she was about 5, was the Second World War, and of course Britain was enormously affected by this. Her father joined the army virtually right away. Actually, he was one of the people that was escaped on the small ships off of Dunkirk a year later. But anyway, he went off to war, and they didn't have very much money because they had only his salary from the military, so from the army. So they moved down to Van's mother's house, to the grandmother's house, which was in Bournemouth. And so she lived there during the war. They lived there with the grandmother, the mother, the aunt. Actually, there were 2 aunts. And then they took in a couple of lodgers, a couple of ladies lodgers. So it was a very female-oriented household, needless to say. They had to be very frugal. They didn't have much money at all, but they lived in this, the Birches, this beautiful big old Victorian house with a giant garden, and that was everything Jane Goodall could want in the world was living in this garden and spending time here with her pets and her books. She went to school there in Bournemouth, or just outside of Bournemouth. I don't know whether this is actually true, but the biographies all describe her as a mediocre and disinterested student. I find that a little bit hard to believe, but because she always seemed to get onto things so much. But anyway, she did love to write, and she did a lot of writing. She kept journals and other sorts of things. And she continued at school until she was 18. After the war, her father stayed on in the army, went to, well, other colonial places like Hong Kong. It's still colonial days, like Hong Kong. And so he was rarely home. And in 1950, they got a divorce. So they continued to live there in Bournemouth for the rest of her life. In fact, that's the home she returns to today. And her extended family continued to live there I put this picture in because I wanted to say that in many ways she seemed like just an ordinary teenage girl or young early 20s kind of girl. She liked parties, she had boyfriends, she had lots and lots of friends. She worked as a secretary in Oxford for a while, and then she went down to London, worked in a film studio. She was even at one point, her uncle arranged for her to be presented to the Queen in 1956. So she was kind of a regular girl. But she had this dream, and she never forgot this dream. And she had a friend from high school who suggested, offered, asked her if she'd like to come out to Kenya. They had a farm in Kenya. Her father had a farm there. And I guess the girl wanted some companionship. And she asked Jane if she'd like to go out there. And of course, this was dream come true for Jane. So she agreed to that. And she had to work very hard. Of course, they didn't have the money to pay for the passage out to Africa, but she worked as a waitress for several months and got the necessary money for this ship to Kenya. The place was in the highlands of Kenya. I don't know if you've been there or not, but it's high. It's a beautiful place, and just lots and lots of animals. It's fairly dry. It's a really a very pleasant sort of place to be. And she absolutely loved it. And after the invitation was done, she decided that she wanted to stay there. So she got a job in Nairobi, lived in a hostel there in Nairobi. And this was a job as a secretary for a construction company or something. It was just your ordinary job. And so she worked there for a little while, but she was in Africa, that's true, but she wasn't yet studying animals. She had pets. She had a little bush baby that she brought to work every day, but she nonetheless wasn't doing quite what she wanted to do. And somebody told her that if she wanted to study animals, she should talk to Louis Leakey. Leakey was, of course, the famous paleoanthropologist who worked at Olduvai Gorge and discovered early hominids like Australopithecus and so forth, and early hominids also. And so he was quite a bit her senior. He was he was working at the National Museum of Kenya. So she just phoned him up and said that she'd like to talk to him. And he said, well, what do you want? And she just said, well, I want to study animals in Africa. And he arranged to meet her and more or less hired her on the spot as a secretary. And he had other secretaries that he had kind of encouraged to go out and study animals. One had gone to study, the one that had just preceded Jane had gone off to study gorillas, but it hadn't really worked out. She had never really seen them. And so she disappeared. And Leakey wanted somebody, not just a secretary, but he wanted someone who would go out and study chimpanzees. He was particularly keen about that, they're being the closest relatives to humans that are available, because he was interested in what those early hominids did that he was studying. What was their behavior like? And he thought studying chimps might give some idea of that. He wanted to have he preferred having an untrained woman because he thought women were more patient. And he wanted to have untrained so that she would not come to the study with any particular biases about what chimpanzees ought to be doing. And so they agreed after she was his secretary, she was working for him there in the museum. And they agreed in 1957 that that she would go out and study these chimpanzees. It, however, took a couple of years for him to be able to get the money together to be able to support this project. I put this little side point on there because I think it's an issue that not every, but lots of women have. And certainly Jane had this issue in nearly everything she did because she is, of course, a very attractive woman. Leakey took quite a shine to her, apparently. But she had another boyfriend and she wasn't interested. And apparently they were able to do this in an amicable sort of way because he remained a great mentor and supporter for her the rest of his life. Now, Leakey knew exactly where he wanted this study to be done because he had, he was very familiar with all the places where there were chimpanzees. He wanted it to be done at this study to be conducted at Gombe Stream National Park. It's right on Lake Tanganyika. So this is all at the time, Tanganyika. It got its independence in 61 or 2, something like that. Now Nairobi is way over here. It takes like 4 days to get from Nairobi to Kigoma, which is a very small town next to the park. I want to point out a couple of other things since I've got this slide here. And that is that, as you see, right across the Lake Tanganyika, is the Congo. And Burundi is right up here, Zambia down here. And you know those countries have not always been particularly stable. And so there was always a little bit of worry about this location for once these countries were independent because of the political unrest. Also, I wanted to point out that Dar es Salaam, which is the capital was the capital of Tanzania, is out here on the Indian Ocean. I guess I've pointed out most of the things I need there. Okay, so there were some problems. Excuse me. There were some problems with getting out to the site. One was getting the funding. But Leakey managed to talk. It was hard. I mean, she was a completely untrained scientist. He'd already sent out one of his secretaries. One of Leakey's secretaries had gone out and there wasn't much success. So it was a sort of uncredentialed female. It was a little bit of a stretch, but he has a lot of influence and he managed to talk the National Geographic Society and the Wilkie Foundation into supporting this project. The other problem was that the Parks Commissioner of Tanzania did not want a single white female out in the park by herself. And this was quite a problem for a while. But then her mother came to visit her in Nairobi and got to know Leakey, and Van volunteered, her mother volunteered to go out and to this site with her, which I think is quite a remarkable thing. I think she is every bit as brave, courageous as Jane was, and she would say the same thing. So they went out there in 1960. She had 6 months of funding, 6-month project to be able to start getting data on these these chimpanzees. They set up their tents. They went out there with a game ranger, 2 guides, and as Jane puts it, a slightly inebriated cook. Van, the mother, I love this picture because it's kind of the all-suffering mother kind of picture, because Jane was always doing things and wanting her to help. But she did set up a little bit of a clinic for the local people. And so while Jane was out watching chimps, her mother was in camp talking to the people or dealing with the people. Jane wanted to go out and follow these chimps, see what they were doing, and they were very slow to habituate. They every time she saw one, they would run away. They'd sort of scream and run away. She months after month went by, and she was not able to get any data at all. And it's not easy working there at it's the tropical forest, and she ended up with malaria. Both she and her mother ended up with malaria. We were sick for about a month. This was very arduous. But along about October, she finally, they sort of got a little bit used to her, and she finally started making observations. For example, she could see that every night the chimps made a nest for themselves and they slept in trees. She also made the observation that she observed them while they were scrambling around after something, and she went to see what it was, and it turned out to be that apparently they had killed a bush pig, a little pig, a juvenile pig. Chimpanzees were not supposed to be eating meat. They were vegetarians like gorillas. So this came as a huge surprise. In fact, some people even questioned it. But she saw it a number of times after that. But the biggest observation was that David Graybeard, this older chimp, he was just not particularly bothered by her one way or the other. And he started coming much closer, allowing her to get much closer to him. And she observed him breaking off a little branch, pulling off the leaves, extra little side branches, and then inserting that branch into a termite mound and eating the termites, pulling the termites out and eating the termites out of the mound. So a chimpanzee using a tool. She didn't observe this until November. It was almost time for her to go home. She wrote a telegram, I think it was, to Leakey, and this was his reply. Now we must redefine tool, redefine man, or accept chimpanzees as human. So this was certainly a big surprise. And Leakey was very impressed with her, thought she had done an amazing job in that 6 months. And when she sort of got out of Gombe, he had already arranged for her to become a graduate student at Cambridge. He knew all the lads, in Cambridge. And so he just made this arrangement. And in 1961, she entered graduate school there. I think it was partially the problem of credentials that really convinced him that it was going to be very hard to get funding for her research if she didn't have any credentials. So he made these arrangements. There was one little problem, and that is she did not have an undergraduate degree. And it's hard to get a PhD without an undergraduate degree, but Leakey, they kind of all sort of brushed over that. And in fact, in the end, she has one of only 8 PhDs from Cambridge that got a degree without an undergraduate degree. Her advisor was Robert Hind. He was studying, it was arranged. Hind knew Leakey and was doing some work in Africa. You know, they all know each other, these folks. And so he was working on primates. In fact, he was studying mother-infant interactions in rhesus monkeys. And so he was an appropriate person for her to advise her. It sounds to me as though this was not an easy task. He spent hours and hours and hours with her, tutoring her in how to take data, how to get the note-taking done in a scientific way. She had taken very detailed notes, and it was possible to extract data from those notes. But then what do you do with it? And putting it into doing appropriate analyses and so forth. With Leakey's help, she got funding from the National Geographic Society, and ultimately she got her degree in 1966. And she alternated between Cambridge, and she spent maybe 6 months or so at Gombe in the year, maybe a little bit more, and a couple of months, several months in Oxford, probably one term in Cambridge. Hind, she later said that she thought that, I knew Robert Hind. He was a sort of senior person in the field at the time. He was a really delightful person, very generous. And she said of him later in talking about him, that he was the perfect supervisor for me. He helped transform an enthusiastic but naive young woman into a successful PhD candidate. And most importantly, he taught me to think critically. Not 100%, but I think that was very much what she knows what science is all about, for sure. Okay, early on, I just wanted to make a point that there was a lot of pushback to these early observations that she made. In 1962, so she was just had 2 seasons of research. She gave a big talk at the Zoological Society of London and another at the New York Academy of Sciences, all arranged by the National Geographic, of course. She talked about her observations of meat eating and tool using and so forth. And the senior primatologists at the time, people like Irv DeVore, thought that, well, you know, Leakey's he's just another one of Leakey's secretaries and don't know anything about animal behavior. And I like particularly Cortland's response was that she was out using the St. Francis of Assisi approach to studying chimp behavior, whereas Cortland, was studying them from a blind, which is the proper way to do it. Of course, it's however you can get data. So her research was supported by the National Geographic Society, which was wonderful. They were quite generous. In 1961, the chimps began coming into the camp area, and so she was just getting fabulous observations of mother-infant interactions and all the things that were going on, male-male interactions, mating behavior, which had never been seen, all kinds of things. And the problem was that if you get support from the National Geographic, you have to write articles for the National Geographic. And so she wrote the articles, but she really just didn't have the equipment that was necessary. She tried, but she didn't have the equipment that was necessary to be able to take quality pictures. And so Leakey arranged, Hugo van Leeuwenhoek was a photographer who lived in Nairobi. He had done some work for Leakey. So Leakey got the National Geographic to send this professional photographer out. And they really were a great team. She was able to really help him get fabulous pictures of these chimpanzees, and of course, he provided her with great, wonderful documentation of the research. And of course, 1963, this is why she was still a graduate student. She got sort of the center picture article in the National Geographic, which goes out to, 20,000 people or something. And there was a film a little bit later that Hugo filmed of her, and of course she had, and this was shown on CBS to 20 million people or something. I mean, she had enormous visibility even when she was a graduate student. Well, one thing led to another with Hugo being out there, attractive young man, and after the second season, they got married while she was a graduate student, and and a couple of years later, several years later, after she had finished her degree, young Hugo Eric was born. They called him Grub very affectionately his whole life. So Jane had to split her time. So Hugo was a professional photographer, and his interests were to be photographing carnivores out on the Serengeti. But she needed to work in Gombe on the chimpanzees. So right from the start, it wasn't quite clear how this is going to work, but they split their time between Gombe and Serengeti. So the two of them did a number of studies together she would write and he would take pictures. They did a very nice study on hunting African hunting dogs. There were issues. There was always funding problems, both of Gombe and Serengeti projects. And the new government, Tanzania, was also a bit of a problem. So at Gombe, Jane was incredibly busy with all the things that were going on there, and including lots of visitors. She had so much visibility that there were people always wanting to come and visit, movie stars and government officials and so forth. She continued her writing, and she had students there from Dar es Salaam and University and from Cambridge. There was a lot going on at Gombe. And she finished a popular book called In the Shadow of Man. And this book was a huge success in the popular press. It was a New York Times bestseller kind of book. And so she went to the US and it was been published in 48 different languages. She traveled around a lot, talking to media and so forth. So they spent even less time together after that. But this did result in a relationship with Stanford University, with a psychiatrist there who was interested in the origins of human aggression. And so Jane, after this time, after 1971, she would go out to, she spent 2 months at Stanford every year giving lectures as well. Well, as I said, things weren't looking so good between Hugo and Jane as they spent less and less time together. And in 1973, Jane met the quite remarkable man named Derek Bryson, who was the head of agriculture, the Department of Agriculture, and Minister of Agriculture, and the Director of Parks for the new country of Tanzania. And he was, I believe, the only white in the Tanzanian government, and maybe, yeah, white European in the Tanzanian government. And after a few days together, they decided they were going to be together. and they both got divorces from their husband and wife. They were both married, and they got married. He kind of took over the running of Gombe, and which had some pluses and minuses. He was kind of old school for the folks at Gombe, but he was very protective of Jane, was very worried about her health. And then this very extraordinary thing happened. A group of Congolese militia, I guess you'd call them, came across the lake and invaded the camp. And apparently they were looking for food, but they found these Europeans there and the students there, including students from Stanford. And so there were a number of American students there. And they took them for ransom. And they were held for 40 days or so. And this Derek Bryson was the one that did all the discussing and did all the negotiations for getting them free. And this created very bad feelings amongst the Stanford folks, because they were Stanford students and Bryson wasn't telling anybody anything. He was doing all of the negotiating himself. And the students were released for a high ransom, which of course the Americans had to pay, and a couple of political prisoners were also released. So this was in '75, and Derek Bryson sort of very surprisingly ended up with cancer, and he died in 1980. And her response to this loss was to really dive into her work. She worked at Gombe. She worked on a book. And I wanted to show this to you for the next some years, maybe 8 or 9 years. She worked on this. It's heavy. This is quite a tome, published by Harvard University Press in 1986. It described everything that she had done for the past 25 years or so. And it was really sort of the culmination of her life's work. In honor of this, she was asked to organize a conference on the chimpanzees and she invited, it was hers to invite the people. It was organized by the Chicago Academy of Sciences, that she had some interactions with. And so she invited all the people who were studying wild chimps. She invited chimp zoo people. She invited welfare people and the sign language people. There was a group of people studying or training chimps to use sign language. It's a very interesting set of studies. And at the end of this scientific conference, the group kind of got together and decided that they were going to form a new organization called the Committee for Conservation and Care of Chimpanzees. And Jane agreed to be the sort of public face of that organization. And in retrospect, she took that very seriously. And in retrospect, thinking back about this conference, she said that it was really transformative. When I arrived in Chicago, I was a research scientist planning the second volume of Chimpanzees of Gombe, but when I left, I was already in my heart committed to conservation and education. Now, it's a little bit hard to describe everything that she's been doing since then, because it has been at an unbelievably hectic pace. She'll spend 300 days of the year out talking to media and giving talks and so forth and so on. She had already formed the Jane Goodall Institute, but this institute now took on a number of new functions. It had originally just been for getting money for the students at Gombe, but now it was about conservation, welfare, public education. And those were her focus now. She really changed just when she spent very little time after that. I mean, some time, but not a lot of time at Gombe after that. Instead, she would talk to whoever would listen, basically. And the first thing she did right away back in 1987, right after this conference, is that she went to talk to a group of people who were working in, there was a lot of talk about the treatment of chimpanzees in medical labs that were sponsored by the National Institutes of Health. And one of them was at a sort of suburban location in Maryland. And she asked to visit this lab. And this was a lab that used chimps. This was 1986, 87. We were at the height of the AIDS epidemic. This is a time when, since chimps were so close to humans, they thought that chimps would be the sort of model organism for studying AIDS. And they were already the model organism for studying hepatitis. And because no other animals were getting hepatitis, only chimps. And what they were doing was bringing in infants from the wild, rearing them up, and then putting them into experiments. She said of this visit, it was a visit I shall never forget. Room after room was lined with small bear cages, stacked one above the other, in which chimpanzees sat huddled, far gone in depression and despair. She was very much affected by, I mean, there wasn't even a way for them to make a nest. There wasn't for them to sleep in. I mean, she knew how they lived in the wild, and this was very upsetting to her. She wrote a very plea for chimps, big New York Times article. So she went and talked to senators, anybody that she felt would be able to make a difference. And she came upon Senator John Melcher, who is a veterinarian from Montana. And Melcher, after talking to Jane, and I think after visiting Gombe, although I'm not sure about that, he inserted into the NIH appropriations bill a statement that no funds shall be used by the NIH on any project that entails the capture or procurement of chimpanzees obtained in the wild. So this really put an end to this practice of bringing in these chimps. Chimpanzees are endangered species, and the Endangered Species Act was in force, but there was an exception for chimpanzees. There was sort of an exception for chimpanzees. So she got that clarified along with some other people, and then she talked to the U.S. Secretary of State, and I know that he visited Gombe, saw what the chimpanzees were like, and he made it so that the United States would now enforce the Endangered Species Act for chimpanzees and not allow any wild chimpanzees to be brought into the United States. So, early on, only a couple of years, and she was having a lot of success at these things that she was interested in. And there occurred later I'm sort of bringing this story forward. In 2000, it was agreed that any chimps that were in medical research labs, when they were ready to retire, they would go into NIH-sponsored sanctuaries, wild sanctuary, sort of native, natural-looking sanctuaries, and would be able to live out their natural life in these sanctuaries rather than euthanizing all these lab chimps. And but that only raised the question of when should a chimp retire? And that was not clear at all. But in 2015, 5 years later, it was agreed that all lab chimps should go to retirement, period. And so there are a whole series of these retirement sanctuaries where they take care of all their needs for the rest of their lives. Yeah, so I thought they were sort of CCRCs. Okay, so that's one whole set of issues that she was interested in, was these welfare issues, and just hugely successful. Another set of issues is the conservation of chimps in Africa. And she estimates in 1960, when she first went out there, that there were probably about 1 million chimpanzees in Africa, in Central Africa area. But there has been a lot of loss, and by 2010 or so, there's only about 150,000 of them. And there are a lot of reasons for this. Habitat loss is a big one. But there are some other problems also. Historically, people would go out, of course, chimpanzees were hunted historically, that's true. But it was just sort of local indigenous people. But with all of the logging that was going on in places like Congo, with the oil and gas industries and the opening up of they opened up the forests and had roads going deep into the forest. Now people can go, hunters can go way into the forest. And they would go out, camp out there, and collect meat and hunt anything that moved out there, apparently. And they would then smoke it or dry it and bring it in to markets where, and bring it into bushmeat markets. And there's a huge population increase. There's all kinds of refugees, and they were selling. There was a big need for meat. It sold well, and it was free. Of course, all you had to do was go out and hunt it. And so there's a big market in bushmeat, and that has been accounted for a lot of this loss of chimpanzees. And they would kill. What particularly bothered Jane was that they would kill the parent, the mother, and then they'd gather up the infant and take it into town and sell it as a pet. And so this is what she said, infants were sold in markets alongside their dead mothers. So things like that really would get to her. Me too. It's a terrible thing. So they were sold, these bush meat was sold to city dwellers in particular liked eating bush meat. So what do you do? So in Africa, in most of these countries, it is illegal to hold endangered species. It's illegal to sell them as pets in markets. Jane would go into these markets and talk to the authorities and get these baby chimps, these infants, confiscated. But then what do you do with them? You've got to have a place to take them, to put them. And so what she managed to do was she, of course, went to the people that were causing the trouble. She went to Conoco Oil, which had been had a huge lease, oil and gas lease in the Congo. And she asked them to put their money where their mouth was. She asked them to sponsor or buy up a set of some land for a sanctuary for African chimps. And even though the oil and gas lease had not actually resulted in anything, the Conoco did not find any oil or gas in their explorations. Nonetheless, they agreed to set up this sanctuary. And she flew out to Congo and worked at getting a sanctuary set up on this gas lease area. So that was another set of things that she was doing, was working in the conservation realm and able to make a lot of progress there. She has also been very involved in improving conditions right there around in Kigoma and in the area around Lake Tanganyika. And so she's been very involved in and the Goodall Institute and her folks working in the Goodall Institute have been very involved with training people, and many of them have become assistants, field assistants at Gombe, and sustainable agriculture and providing them with many microloans and so forth. So this is another big focus of the Jane Goodall Institute. And finally, as you mentioned at the beginning, she started this program called Roots and Shoots, which is an environmental and humanitarian program primarily for young people, although there's others. It's in 140 different countries. There are chapters in lots of different countries right now. And it's when you start a chapter, you agree to 3 kinds of projects. And they are how to make the world one to help people, one to help animals, and one to help the environment. So it's that effort to really engage people and get them. And of course, Jane is involved in, oops, sorry, I didn't mean to go forward. Jane is involved in all sorts of in helping out in these things, and she's involved in going to all the activities and so forth. She's really very involved in all of this. And through all this period, it's just, to my thinking, astonishing productivity. She's published a whole bunch of things with her students, scientific papers with her students, book chapters, films. She's been writing children's books, right and left, a whole 15 different children's books. She has other books that she's written. It's just amazing to me. 166 awards, all of which probably require a talk and, you know, media issues and so forth. It's just really an astonishing life to my thinking. And so she has gone from being, in these last 35 years or so, she's gone from being this scientist, very devoted to field research on chimps, into working with people and really trying everything she can to open doors. And people ask her, what is the secret of your youth? And she says, well, there's so much to do. And I thought just a very short little video would be helpful just for you to just kind of 2-minute video just to sort of see what she is like.
Ladies and gentlemen, you are in for a special treat tonight. Dr. Jane Goodall.
I'm a huge fan, but I'm sure you hear that all the time.
It's better than hearing I hate you, isn't it?
People think of her as being associated with chimpanzees only, but actually she's much more than that.
All these young people looking at her like she was a deity.
There's so much love showered onto me. There was a certain point when I thought, well, this is going to help me do what I do.
To change the lives of so many people. Over the years, the picture has become bigger and bigger.
She goes for the kind of change the world is hungry for.
What's Jane Goodall doing working with an oil company? Well, that's what you do if you want to make change. You work with the bad guys.
My job is to go around and inspire people and get them to take action. People always ask me if I really have hope, but my reasons for hope are the young people.
We say slow down. She says, no, time is running out. Time to speed up.
I have to run, I have to run.
I think the cost is very high, but she's driven by her mission.
If you want somebody to change their mind, it's no good arguing. You've got to reach the heart.
Most scientists don't talk about hope. Jane gives that human side.
She started something, and we do not want it to stop.
When I'm gone, there are hundreds and hundreds of young people around the world, and already they're taking over. Feeling that I have a message to give, that I was put on this planet to do it, I have to do it.
So that was just a little National Geographic Society put that together. So coming back to the where we started, you know, for a while I thought that the reason that she was so popular and had reached such, you know, the most popular scientist, the most recognized scientist in the world, I thought for a while, well, that's because she got so much help from so much publicity from the National Geographic. But of course, today, the National Geographic is doing things for her because she's so popular and it helps them, so that doesn't really explain everything. And for a while, I thought maybe it was, Louis Leakey, because he had given her and been such a mentor and had given her so much assistance and advocacy early on. But, he's been dead since 72, so that doesn't really explain what's going on. If you were to ask her, she would say that it was support from her mother, because her mother did allow her to go out there at that time and helped her enormously in the early days, as did Hugo. But I don't know, somehow none of these really have, they're the kinds, they're the thoughts that I had as I was working on this talk. And at the end, I'm afraid that I have sort of come to the conclusion that Jane Goodall is really quite an extraordinary person, and that she has the ability to connect not just with chimpanzees, but with people. And she does it in a very real and generous, genuine sort of way. So I will stop right there. And if anyone has any questions, I'll be happy to try to do that. Don't disappear. Oh, well, okay. Well, I might have a question or two that would be helpful. Okay.
Are there any questions?
Yeah.
Excuse me, get the mic back here.
I enjoyed your lecture, but I would like to ask you, what is your fascination with horseshoe crabs?
Oh, that's a talk for another day. There's a lot of things that are interesting about horseshoe crabs. So I mostly studied the mating system, but every single person in this room has benefited from horseshoe crabs, and I'll just let you wait and find out what that is. Yeah. Anything on Jane Goodall? She's 89. She is still alive and going strong. She, of course, during COVID, she called herself a remote Jane Goodall because she set up things in her house in Bournemouth. But now she's back. In fact, one of my slides there that shows what her schedule was in March. She had a talk in Colorado, a talk in, I think, Chicago, someplace else, and Tampa. So she had 4 big evenings with Jane, interview evenings with Jane Goodall, and that wasn't the media. Those are just 4 big talks. I don't have all the other parts of her schedule, but she's very active still.
Could you tell us how long horseshoe crabs have been around?
Another day.
Another day, yeah. I'll be happy to give a talk on horseshoe. I can do that much more easily than Jane Goodall. Well, it depends on what exactly you mean by horseshoe crabs. But the lineage has been around for 450 million years. Yeah, a long time. The species or the genus has only been around since the Jurassic.
A comment. I met Jane at Give Kids the World in Kissimmee, and she came to meet with the founder, who had about the same kind of personality and ability to organize people. They use 1,000 volunteers a day. And that's what she was really concerned about, is how do you do that and how do you keep it going? But she was very mild-mannered and a joy just to talk to.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jane. I told you some of this before, but this might be interesting to some of you that are asking questions. I used to play bridge with a woman that worked with Jane Goodall some 25, 30 years ago in Africa, and her refrigerator door was filled with pictures of Jane Goodall and the chimps and so on. And of course, we all ask her questions. And she said she's a wonderful person to work for. And she is so kind. I learned so much from her. She said it was just the highlight of my life. So there was something just in her personality.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah, I didn't know that until I started watching all these videos. There's a lot of YouTube videos if you want to see a little bit more about her, including a new film that, in fact, I think got an Emmy or something. It's old material that Hugo had that had been lost, and it was just been reissued just in the last year or so. So yeah, I agree that she seemed like that. I also know some people who work with her. Barbara Smuts worked with her. She's a professor in Michigan for many years. And she was actually one of the people that was kidnapped. But still said, just said that this is the most wonderful thing in her life was to work with Jane Goodall. So.
Did Jane Goodall's son follow in her footsteps?
No, Grubb is married a Tanzanian, well, sort of, a little bit, maybe. He married a Tanzanian woman, and they have 2 children, Angel and Merlin, I think are their names, and they are working for the Jane Goodall Institute. And Grubb lives in the house that Derek Bryson owned in Dar es Salaam. And he is a sport fishing captain, I think. He runs a sport fishing business in Dar es Salaam. So, and I don't think he went to college for very long. I think maybe he went to Dar, but not others, not Cambridge.
Well, thank you so much.
Let me just say, you asked me about, could you put up that, you asked me about that. Deb sent this to me, and she wanted me to say something about this. Just one more, just the next slide. Oh, I can do that. Next slide. One forward. There we go. This was a Far Side cartoon. It says, well, another blonde hair conducting a little more research with that Jane Goodall tramp. But this was published in 1987. Jane was apparently in the field at the time. And this created quite a stir for the people at the Jane Goodall Institute. And they ended up suing Gary Larson because they thought that this was really insulting to her. A couple of months later, when Jane got out of the field, she found out about this suit and she put an end to it immediately. She thought this was hilarious. And in fact, she sort of called up Gary Larson and apologized for this and ended up writing the foreword to one of his collections of animal cartoons because she thought that he was doing a real service by acquainting people with often rather interesting animal behavior in the process. So I think that just gives you a little hint of what she's kind of person that she is. So anyway.
Is there anything else you want to share before we put this down?
I think that the time is up.
Okay.
We probably should run along. Yeah. Yes, there are.